Imagine bursting through these heavy oak doors of a gloomy 17th century Eastern European castle.
Oh, setting the scene right away. I like it.
Right. Like, you are a royal investigator. You've heard all the horrific whispers, the terrifying rumors that have literally been bleeding out of this fortress for years.
And you think you know exactly what you're walking into.
Exactly. You kick the doors open, fully expecting to catch this gothic vampire in the act, like a monstrous aristocrat bathing in a tub of fresh virgin blood to preserve her eternal youth. You brace yourself for the horror, but
But instead, what do you actually find?
yeah, you find a middle-aged estate manager just sitting quietly at a table, eating her dinner.
The contrast there is just completely jarring.
It really is.
But I mean, it perfectly encapsulates this profound disconnect between the legends we all think we know and the incredibly dark historical reality of what actually happened.
So welcome to this deep dive, meticulously crafted specifically for you, the learner. Today we are taking a sledgehammer to, honestly, the greatest vampire myth in human history.
We really are.
Our mission today is a rigorous, chronological, and entirely uncensored forensic examination of the life and crimes of Countess Elizabeth Báthory.
And just to be clear, to do this, we are drawing exclusively from a highly detailed, grounded historical text. We're tossing out all the Hollywood embellishments.
Toss them right out the window. We're completely ignoring the campfire ghost stories.
We kind of have to, right? I mean, if you genuinely want to understand how a human being transforms into a monster, you have to completely strip away that supernatural safety net.
Yeah, the folklore almost makes it too easy to digest.
Exactly. We have to look past the later folklore of, magical bloodbaths and focus on the cold, hard, terrifying timeline. We're going to analyze the historical data to figure out exactly why this happened.
The psychology behind the atrocities.
Right. And mechanically, like logistically, how she got away with it for as long as she did.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can even examine the crimes, we have to establish the baseline of her reality. We're starting in 1560.
So put yourself in the mindset of a European noble in the mid-16th century.
Yeah, to understand Elizabeth Báthory, we really have to look at the environment she was born into. And let's be clear, this wasn't just wealth. Like, this wasn't just having a nice castle on a hill somewhere.
Not at all.
This was unimaginable, completely unchecked privilege.
It was absolute regional dominance. I mean, Elizabeth Báthory was born on August 7th, 1560. This was on a family estate in Nyírbátor, located in Royal Hungary, and she spent her early childhood at Exeter Castle.
Okay.
Her family, the House of Báthory, they were the geopolitical heavyweights of their era.
Yeah.
They weren't just rich landowners. They were effectively the state.
Give us a sense of that scale. Because, when we say noble, modern people might just think of someone with a fancy title and a big trust fund.
Right, like a celebrity or something.
Yeah, exactly. But the Báthorys were operating on a completely different level of power, weren't they?
Oh, they were making and breaking nations.
Right.
Her uncle, Stephen Báthory, was the Prince of Transylvania, and he eventually ascended to become the King of Poland and the Grand Duke of Lithuania.
Okay, so literal royalty.
Yes. And her older brother, also named Stephen, he served as a Judge Royal of Hungary.
Which means what, exactly, in that context?
That meant he was one of the highest-ranking legal and political authorities in the entire kingdom. Plus, she had ancestors who were Dukes of Masovia from the Piast dynasty.
That is just a staggering amount of influence.
From the moment she took her first breath, she was surrounded by a family that answered to almost no one. They wielded the absolute power of life and death over the people who lived on their vast lands.
And crucially, she was raised a Calvinist Protestant.
That is a very important detail.
Which, it seems like a minor theological detail at first glance. But in the context of the 16th century Habsburg Empire, which was staunchly Catholic, that religious affiliation is going to become highly politically relevant when the walls finally start closing in on her decades later.
Oh, absolutely. The religious and political tensions of the era are basically the invisible scaffolding holding this entire story together.
Right.
But going back to her childhood, because she was born into this very upper echelon of nobility, she received an extraordinary education.
Which was pretty unusual for a woman in the 1500s.
Highly unusual. She wasn't just taught to sew and manage servants. She was taught Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek.
Wow, 4 languages.
Yeah, she was incredibly cultured, literate, and deeply embedded in the intellectual elite of the aristocracy.
But her childhood wasn't just, language lessons and sprawling castle grounds. There is a fascinating and frankly disturbing medical footnote in our sources that I really want us to dig into.
Like falling sickness.
Yeah, exactly. As a child, Bathory suffered from multiple severe seizures, and at the time, this was likely a form of epilepsy.
Most likely, yes.
But 16th century doctors obviously didn't understand neurology, so they diagnosed this as the falling sickness.
And the medical context of the 1500s is absolutely vital for understanding her psychological development here. Medical science at the time relied heavily on humoral theory.
Right, the four humors.
Exactly. Yeah. And what we would now consider just grotesque folk remedies. The treatments for this falling sickness were incredibly macabre.
Okay, brace yourselves for this.
According to the standard medical practices of that specific era, treatments for these seizures included taking the blood of a healthy non-sufferer
A healthy person.
and physically rubbing that blood onto the lips of the epileptic child.
Wait, mechanics-wise, how does that even work? They would just draw blood from a healthy servant and smear it directly onto her mouth while she was actively seizing.
Exactly. That was considered medicine. Or, even more disturbingly, as the child's seizure episode was ending, they might be fed a specialized medical mixture.
Uh-oh.
This concoction contained a non-sufferer's blood combined with actual pieces of a human skull ground up into the mixture.
That is just horrifying to picture. Just drinking blood and bone dust.
It sounds like witchcraft to us, but this was legitimate, sanctioned medical care for a wealthy noble in that time.
But think about the psychological extrapolation here for a young developing mind. Like, if we want to understand why someone becomes desensitized to human suffering, how might that early repeated exposure to blood normalize grotesque physical violations?
That's a huge factor to consider.
I mean, imagine you were an 8-year-old child. Your caretakers are literally feeding you the blood and bone of other human beings to cure you. Not as an injury, but as medicine.
Administered by the adults you completely trust.
Exactly. The boundary of bodily autonomy, the natural human taboo surrounding blood and human remains, it's fundamentally shattered. It's totally obliterated very early on.
That is a highly plausible psychological baseline. Because when blood and body parts are deeply medicalized like that and presented as a cure, they lose their inherent horror.
They just become materials.
Exactly. They become resources.
Right.
Furthermore, some historical sources have proposed that she was actively trained by her family to be cruel,
Like specifically taught to be sadistic.
to view the lower classes as little more than livestock, essentially.
Yeah.
Now, the specifics of that active training are debated by modern historians. But the environment itself was undeniably brutal, and her medical care was viscerally tied to the extraction of bodily fluids from others.
And then, right on the precipice of adulthood, we hit a bizarre bump in the timeline, the teenage pregnancy rumor.
Ah,
The historical record notes that at the age of 13, just before she was married, there was this persistent rumor that she gave birth to a child fathered by a local peasant boy.
a huge scandal, allegedly.
Right, and supposedly, to hide the scandal, this baby was paid off, given to a trusted local woman, and whisked away to Wallachia, just far out of sight.
It's definitely a compelling narrative of early deviance,
Yeah.
but as critical analysts, we really have to look at the sourcing of this carefully.
Right, where did this story even come from?
Well, the supposed evidence of a scandalous pregnancy only emerged long after her death. It was entirely based on rumors spread by peasants, passed down through oral tradition.
So no actual documents from the time.
No. Because of the sheer lack of contemporaneous documentation, the validity of the rumor is heavily disputed by modern historians.
I have to push back hard on the validity of that rumor, too. I mean, think about how human nature works, especially when society is trying to explain a monster.
It's a very common pattern.
It feels entirely too convenient. Long after she dies and is exposed as a sadistic mass murderer, suddenly there's peasant gossip surfacing saying, oh, she was deviant from the start. She fraternized with the help at age 13.
Just trying to fill in the blanks.
Exactly. To me, it sounds exactly like history trying to retroactively paint her as inherently corrupted from puberty. It's an attempt to add a neat little sexual scandal to round out the villain archetype.
That's a very sharp, critical read of how folklore develops. Society often tries to create a cohesive, linear narrative of deviance to make sense of the senseless.
We want it all to make sense.
Right. We want the villain to have an origin story of moral failing. But whether this teenage pregnancy actually happened or not, it certainly didn't disrupt the grand geopolitical plan for her life.
Not at all.
Because in 1574, when she was 14 years old, she was officially engaged to Count Ferenc Nádasdy. And this wasn't a romance. This was a massive, calculated political arrangement between two of the most powerful aristocratic circles in Europe.
They were officially married on May 8th, 1575, at a palace in what is today Slovakia. And if we want a modern analogy for this union, like, don't think of a wedding. Think of a massive corporate merger.
That's the best way to describe it.
This marriage combined vast, sprawling land ownerships across Transylvania and the Kingdom of Hungary. It consolidated wealth, armies, and political influence.
It made them an unstoppable force.
Yeah. And as a wedding gift, this is wild, Nadezhdy gave her the castle of Kate.
Also known as Katus.
Right, which is nestled in the Carpathian Mountains. He basically handed her the keys to what would eventually become the infamous epicenter of her crimes.
And her life with Nadezhdy over the next couple of decades establishes something vital for us to understand: her supreme capability and her unyielding authority.
She wasn't just sitting around.
Not at all. She was not a passive wife locked in a tower. 3 years into the marriage, in 1578, Nadezhdy became the chief commander of the Hungarian troops.
The Black Knight of Hungary, some people called him.
Yes, he was leading forces in the long war against the Ottoman Empire. Because of his military obligations, he was constantly away from home, commanding troops on the frontier.
Which means Elizabeth was left entirely in charge of the domestic empire. She wasn't just sitting in a parlor doing needlepoint and waiting for letters.
No, she was busy.
She was managing massive business affairs. She was essentially the warrior wife. While he was away, she managed multiple immense estates, which included direct, absolute responsibility for the thousands of Hungarian and Slovak people living on those lands.
She was their governor, their judge, everything.
She oversaw agriculture, she provided medical care to the peasantry, and she was charged with the actual physical military defense of her husband's property.
Which was no small task given the geography.
No. These estates were right on the strategic route to Vienna. The village of Sete had already been plundered by the Ottomans previously. The threat of invasion was very, very real, and she was literally the last line of defense.
She was effectively the sovereign ruler of these lands in his absence. She managed the economy, the justice system, and the military preparedness. And during this incredibly demanding time, she also had 5 confirmed children: Anna, Orsika, Cataline, Andras, and Pel.
5 kids on top of everything else.
All cared for by armies of governesses, of course, while she ran the empire.
I look at her daily life during this period, and the best analogy is a modern-day wartime CEO managing a massive multinational conglomerate while the primary leader is deployed overseas.
It's incredibly impressive when you strip away the later history.
It is. She is running complex logistics, defending hostile borders, managing vast agricultural supply chains, handling medical crises for thousands of tenant farmers, and raising the next generation of heirs.
It entirely shatters the myth of a vain, idle aristocrat just staring in a mirror all day.
Totally shatters it. It emphasizes her immense organizational power, her fierce intelligence, and her absolute autonomy. She was a highly competent, ruthless executive of her domain.
Which is exactly why the transition into the next phase of her life is so chilling. Because in 1604, the geopolitical landscape of her life shifted permanently.
Nadezhdy's death.
Yes, Ferenc Nadezhdy died on January 4th of that year at the age of 48. He had been suffering since 1601 from a mysterious, debilitating illness that caused agonizing pain in his legs.
He was basically paralyzed, right?
Yes, it left him permanently disabled and bedridden by 1603.
So for almost 29 years, she was married to this powerful military commander. But with his death, she is left a widow in her mid-40s with ultimate, unchecked, terrifying authority.
The only ceiling above her was removed.
Exactly. The single tether of oversight, the only person on Earth who legally outranked her on her own lands, is gone. So we are now transitioning from her role as a strict, capable estate manager to the terrifying, uncensored forensic reality of her sadistic crimes.
This is where the historical record gets incredibly dark.
Yeah, and just as a warning to you listening, we are strictly adhering to our mission to explore the historical sources without censorship. That means we must painstakingly detail the exact methodology of the torture she inflicted, as recorded in the sworn legal testimonies.
It is highly disturbing forensic analysis.
It is, but we have to do it.
We do, because it is necessary to separate the myth from the monster. During the trial that would eventually take place, the atrocities detailed by witnesses were horrific, and they were recorded as occurring across several of Báthory's castles.
It wasn't just isolated incidents.
No, the methodology described wasn't just random chaotic violence. It was highly systematic, deliberate, and sustained. Witnesses describe severe, prolonged beatings with cudgels.
And a cudgel is essentially a heavy club, right?
Yes, thick, heavy sticks used to shatter bone and pulp muscle. But the violence quickly escalated from blunt force to intricate, sharp force trauma.
Right.
She would deliberately plunge knives into the arms and feet of her victims.
And the specifics of the testimonies regarding the sharp force trauma are just brutal. There were consistent, corroborated reports of sewing needles being used as instruments of torture.
Meticulously used.
Witnesses described needles being meticulously inserted into the lips, the arms, the shoulders, and shoved deep under the fingernails of these young women.
It's agonizing just to think about.
They detailed specific instances of fingers being cut off entirely using common household scissors and shears.
And we have the direct, recorded accounts from her accomplices to corroborate this. One of them, a woman named Dorothea Santos, testified specifically about the psychological and physical mechanics of the needles.
What did she say?
She stated that Báthory would personally stick thick sewing needles into the fingers of her victims. And Dorothea quoted Báthory directly in her testimony.
Oh, wow, an actual quote.
Yes, Báthory would say, if it hurts the whore, then she can pull it out.
That is sickening.
But Dorothea added a horrifying caveat to this twisted game. If the girl actually dared to reach over and pull the needle out of her own flesh to stop the pain, Báthory would immediately take a knife and chop the girl's finger off entirely.
That specific detail is such a chilling glimpse into the psychological game she was playing. Because at that point, it's not just about inflicting physical pain, it's about creating an impossible, sadistic double bind for the victim.
A trap they can't escape.
Right. You force the victim to choose between enduring excruciating, continuous agony or taking action to stop it and suffering a permanent, horrific mutilation as punishment for seeking relief. That requires a level of calculated malice that goes far beyond simple anger or cruelty.
And the torture extended far beyond sharp instruments into environmental and elemental torment. She weaponized the castle itself.
Yeah, the dungeon.
Victims were locked in the cold, damp dungeons and deliberately starved for weeks.
And they used extreme temperatures to destroy the body, too. They would take red-hot iron pokers like the kind used to stoke the massive castle fireplaces and scorch the arms and abdomens of the girls.
Burning them alive, essentially.
Yeah. And on the complete opposite end of the spectrum, witnesses described how girls were forced to stand completely naked outside in the brutal, freezing Eastern European winter cold.
And winters there are unforgiving.
Absolutely brutal. Then, Báthory and her accomplices would carry buckets of icy water and douse the naked girls over and over until they literally froze to death, becoming statues of ice in the courtyard.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, analyzing the psychology of sadism here is critical. Look at the specific methods we just detailed. Starvation, freezing, burning with hot irons, the meticulous surgical use of needles and scissors.
It's highly mechanical.
Exactly. This forensic reality absolutely destroys the later folklore myth that she was doing this to harvest blood for youth-preserving baths.
Oh, completely destroys it.
Think about it logically. You do not freeze someone to death, or starve them to a husk, or cauterize their flesh with red-hot irons if your primary goal is to harvest pristine, flowing blood.
Right. If you were trying to fill a bathtub, cauterizing a wound with a hot poker is the exact opposite of what you want to do. You are stopping the bleeding.
Exactly. The evidence proved that this was never about a search for eternal youth or cosmetic vanity. This is about absolute intoxicating power over life and death.
The control of it.
It was the grotesque medicalization and mechanization of pain. It was sadistic pleasure derived entirely from total domination and the slow, deliberate breaking of another human being.
And here's where it gets really interesting in terms of criminal profiling and escalation. Because initially, the historical sources note that she exclusively tortured and killed peasants.
A very vulnerable population.
Exactly. For years, she preyed on the daughters of the local serfs. And because they were peasants, their disappearances went largely ignored by the authorities. Nobody with any real political power in the 16th century cared if a serf went missing. They were considered property.
But eventually, she hit a logistical wall. Even peasants have a breaking point. The local villages surrounding her castles, Sisset, Sarvar, and others, they realized what was happening.
Word gets around.
The terrifying reputation of the lady widow Nadazdi spread through the valleys. The peasant families simply refused to let their daughters go work at the castle, no matter what wages or benefits were offered. Her supply of victims completely dried up.
So she had to adapt. She had an addiction to sadism, and she needed a new supply chain. So in the winter of 1609, she made a massive strategic shift. She opened a gynaeceum.
A very bold move.
So bold. Now, if you aren't familiar with that term, think of it as an elite finishing school. She marketed this school directly to the lesser nobility, the gentry of the region.
The aspirational class, basically.
Right. She lured these high-born young women to her castle under the guise of teaching them courtly etiquette, moral instruction, and giving them the immense social cachet of associating with the highest-ranking countess in the land. For a lesser noble, having your daughter educated by Elizabeth Báthory was like getting her into the Ivy League.
It was a brilliantly calculated pivot. The gynaeceum brought in funding, but far more importantly, it provided a brand new, fresh demographic of victims, delivered willingly right to her doorstep by their own ambitious parents.
And we see this exact pattern in modern criminal profiling. Serial killers often escalate their behavior when they get bored, or they change their modus operandi when their circumstances change.
Supply and demand.
Exactly. Báthory escalated her victim pool to a higher social class entirely out of supply and demand necessity. But that escalation was her fatal flaw. It was the beginning of the end.
She flew too close to the sun.
She really did. Because by targeting the daughters of the nobility, even the lesser nobility, she was suddenly targeting victims whose parents actually had a voice in the kingdom. They had the funds to travel, the literacy to write letters, and the social standing to demand answers.
Which leads us perfectly into the next phase of our historical timeline. The witnesses speak.
The actual evidence.
Yes, because she targeted the lesser nobility through the gynaeceum, those parents started asking very loud questions. And because her crimes were so incredibly extensive and industrialized, she left an irrefutable forensic footprint behind. We aren't just relying on rumors anymore. We have sworn first-hand accounts.
And this is arguably the most crucial part of the historical record to understand, because when you look at the accomplices, the peasant servants who physically helped her, like Dorothea, they were brutally tortured into giving their confessions before they were executed.
And that's a huge problem for historical accuracy.
Right. In historical terms, a confession extracted on the rack or under the threat of hot pincers is always highly suspect. People will say absolutely anything to make the pain stop.
Of course they will.
But crucially, several key witnesses in the Báthory case were not tortured. They were high-ranking male staff members who provided untortured sworn testimony in a court of law.
Let's examine the testimony of Benedict Deseo. He was not a lowly servant. He was the head of the Lord's staff at Castle Cecchetti.
So he's high up the chain.
He was essentially the chief operating officer of the castle, responsible for its daily functions. He was around Báthory constantly. He testified under oath about a specific victim, a shoemaker's daughter named Ilonka.
And his testimony is so graphic and specific. Deseo stated that he witnessed Báthory strip Ilonka naked and begin to cruelly torment her. He testified that Báthory took a knife, started at the girl's fingers, and physically shoved the blade up the length of both of her arms.
A horrific level of violence.
Unimaginable. Then she flogged the girl mercilessly, took a burning candle, and held the flame against her bare skin, burning her until the girl eventually succumbed to the shock and trauma and died.
Deseo also corroborated the specific use of needles that the tortured accomplices have mentioned, which adds massive credibility to those accounts.
Because he wasn't coerced into saying it.
Exactly. He testified that he saw Báthory stick a sewing needle into a victim's arms and literally use the needle to cut her way up the arm of a girl. And the twisted justification. Báthory did it specifically because the girl couldn't sew properly.
That is just chilling.
He also noted the environmental torture, testifying that she would deliberately withhold food and water from victims until they were slowly dying of dehydration.
Then we have the testimony of Gurgely Pastore. He was a court judge at Castle Sarvar. He was a 40-year-old magistrate when he testified, a man whose entire career was built on the law.
A highly credible witness.
Very credible. He talked about a young woman from Bratislava named Model. Model was already married and had a young child. But Báthory forced her into the gynaeceum and demanded she dress up and act like a young, unmarried virgin girl.
A complete psychological degradation.
Completely. When Model pleaded for forgiveness, crying and saying she couldn't play this part because she was a mother and a wife, the punishment for her disobedience was unimaginable.
Jacob Savasi, another untortured witness and court official, added horrifying details to Pastore's account regarding Model. Savasi testified that because Model refused to play this twisted role of a young girl, Báthory ordered that her flesh be cut out of her body and roasted.
Oh my God.
She tormented the young mother continuously until she was finally killed at Sarvar. Again, we have to emphasize, these are sworn, untortured statements from court judges, magistrates, and heads of staff, not coerced peasants.
Then there's the account of Martinus Shinati, a 48-year-old nobleman. He testified about going with a man named Janos Balansky to visit Báthory.
To get his sister back, right?
Yes. Janos was desperately trying to retrieve his sister from the Gynaeceum. When they arrived, Báthory flat out refused to give the sister back. When Janos demanded to at least see her with his own eyes to confirm she was okay, they were made to wait an hour.
Buying time?
Exactly. When the sister finally appeared, Shanati testified under oath that she was severely weakened from torture. She was in so much agonizing pain that she could barely hold out her hands, and she was bitterly crying. Shani noted that the sister later died from her injuries and was buried on the grounds.
Chanity also mentioned in his testimony that he had heard dark rumors that Báthory had minced the flesh of virgins and served it as meat.
The cannibalism rumor.
Right. But it's vital to note that the historical record presents that specific detail purely as hearsay. It was something he heard whispered around the castle rather than something he personally witnessed. But the physical, broken state of Janos' sister was a first-hand, eyewitness observation of a nobleman.
And the mothers of the victims from the Gynaeceum also went on the official record. These were noble women themselves, mothers who had sent their daughters away for an education.
Trusting her completely.
Anna Zaleste testified that her daughter Zasuska was accepted into the court, only to be systematically beaten and tortured to death within the walls of the Gynaeceum. Dorotia Dzerniski testified that her own daughter Ertsibi met the exact same brutal fate.
Anna Kusigi, another noblewoman, actually visited the Gynaeceum multiple times while it was in operation.
And what did she see?
She testified under oath that she saw many victims in a severely tortured state with her own eyes. She walked the halls and saw girls with visibly broken fingers and horribly scorched hands. When she pulled the girls aside and asked them what on earth had happened, they openly told her that the Countess had burned them with red-hot irons.
I mean, think about the sheer, staggering brazenness of that. She had visiting noble women walking through her halls, seeing these horribly injured, mutilated girls walking around in broad daylight. She didn't even try to hide them.
She really didn't.
Which brings us to the forensic aftermath, the bodies. Because logistically, you cannot kill hundreds of people without facing an absolute nightmare regarding the disposal of human remains.
And she handled that grim logistics incredibly poorly. The Castellan of Set Castle, Michael Horvath, the man in charge of the physical fortress, stated that he personally knew of at least 7 girls who died at the Gynaeceum.
Where were they buried?
They were buried in a little garden just behind the main courtyard, but they were buried in incredibly shallow graves. Horvath testified that the local dogs actually dug up the corpses from the garden and were seen running around the castle grounds carrying human body parts in their mouths.
It is a grotesque image, stray dogs carrying human limbs through a royal courtyard. And it wasn't just dead bodies that slipped through the cracks of her operation. It was alleged that one of her victims actually managed to escape from Sete alive.
Oh, the girl who made it to the village.
Yes. She made it down the mountain to a nearby village with a knife literally still stuck deeply into her foot, and she alerted the horrified locals to what was happening up in the fortress.
When the noble family started pressing Báthory, sending letters and demanding to know why their daughters were suddenly disappearing or dying of mysterious illnesses, she had to invent cover stories.
And they were terrible cover stories.
She concocted a wild, desperate tale that one of the girls in the Gynaeceum had suddenly gone crazy, murdered all the other attendants in a frenzy because she was greedy for their jewelry, and then tragically died by suicide.
I mean, that is just insulting to anyone's intelligence. What's fascinating to me here is the sheer forensic clumsiness of her entire operation.
It's remarkably sloppy.
In modern pop culture, we are trained to think of serial killers as these meticulous, hyper-intelligent criminal masterminds who leave no trace. But the shallow graves in the backyard, the dogs digging up limbs, the escaped girl with a knife in her foot, the utterly flimsy, laughable cover story of a jewelry-crazed, mass-murdering teenager, it shows us that she wasn't a mastermind at all. She was reckless.
She was incredibly reckless because she was protected purely by her rank. She exhibited an arrogance born of absolute, unquestioned impunity.
She thought she was a god on her own lands.
Exactly. She truly believed that because she was a Báthory, because her uncle was a king, because her brother was a judge royal, she would simply never be held accountable by anyone on earth. So she didn't even bother to dig deep graves or hide the bodies properly. She thought she was untouchable.
But the sheer volume of complaints from the noble families finally reached a critical mass, breaking through that impenetrable shield of aristocracy. And that shifts the narrative into the next phase, the investigation and the raid.
The law finally catches up.
The vast legal and political apparatus of the Kingdom of Hungary finally turns its gaze on her.
The catalyst for this legal movement started with a Lutheran minister named István Magyari. Between 1602 and 1604, the rumors of her atrocities were everywhere, permeating the countryside.
He couldn't ignore it anymore.
Right. Magyari bravely started making complaints against her publicly from his pulpit, and he took his grievances directly to the royal court in Vienna. The pressure continued to mount over the years until 1610, when King Matthias II finally decided he could no longer ignore the scandal.
It was too loud.
So he assigned the Palatine of Hungary, György Thurzo, to officially investigate.
Now, let's contextualize the title of Palatine, because if you aren't familiar with 17th century Hungarian politics, think of the Palatine as a mix between a modern prime minister and a Supreme Court Chief Justice.
Extremely powerful.
He was the highest-ranking official in the kingdom, right under the king himself. Thurzo was a devout Lutheran, a seasoned diplomat, and a powerful political figure with his own ambitions. He ordered two royal notaries, András Keresztúri and Moses Jiraki, to start officially collecting evidence in March 1610.
And we actually have the surviving text of the letter Thurzo sent to Jiraki outlining the investigation.
Well, what did it say?
The text of the letter is incredibly revealing regarding how seriously the crown was taking this. Thurzo writes about the severe complaints that Lady Báthory, quote, through some sort of evil spirit has set aside her reverence for God and man, and has killed in cruel and various ways many girls and virgins and other women who lived in her gynecium.
Very formal, but very damning.
He orders the notaries to fan out across the countryside and question everyone, clergy, nobles, commoners, under strict penalty of law, demanding the pure truth be explored.
And boy, did they find the truth. By October 1610, just a few months in, they had gathered 52 sworn statements. By early 1611, that number absolutely exploded to over 300 witness testimonies.
A mountain of evidence.
With this undeniable legal evidence in his hands, Thurzo makes his move. The dragnet closes on New Year's Eve, 1610.
Thurzo arrived completely unannounced at City Castle. He brought his men and arrested Báthory, along with 4 of her key accomplices, basically the inner circle of her terror, Dorothea, Ilona, Katerina, and a young male servant named Janos, who is known as Fitzko.
Now here is where we have to pause and bust another massive piece of the mythology. The Gothic legend, the story told in movies and books, always says that Thurzo burst through the heavy castle doors and caught the Blood Countess red-handed, covered in the blood of a freshly slaughtered virgin, laughing maniacally right in the middle of a dungeon torture session.
Yeah, that's the famous scene everyone pictures. But the historical reality is far more mundane, which somehow makes it even more chilling.
What was she actually doing?
When Thurzo arrived to arrest her that winter night, she wasn't bathing in blood. She was just sitting down quietly eating her dinner.
Just a normal evening meal for a mass murderer.
Exactly. But the castle itself held the undeniable horrors of her reign. Thurzo's letter to his wife, detailing the aftermath of the raid, noted that while searching the premises, his men found one dead girl and another living prey girl still trapped in the castle, waiting to be tortured.
So they caught her right in the middle of her operations.
Yes. Following the sudden arrest, she was taken into royal custody. But crucially, because she was a high-ranking noblewoman, she wasn't put on the rack. She wasn't tortured for information.
Double standards of the nobility.
Very much so. But she did confess in a very twisted, manipulative way. When a man named Pastor Barocius visited her and asked her point blank why she didn't stop her accomplices from committing these horrific murders and tortures, she looked at him and said, "I did it, because even I myself was afraid of them."
Okay, I have to push back on that specific confession. I did it because I was afraid of my own servants. Are you kidding me?
It's hard to believe, isn't it?
Think about who we are talking about. This is the warrior wife. She defended massive estates against the invading Ottoman Empire. She ran a multinational agricultural and military conglomerate. She was born into a family that ruled
She
nations.
was not easily intimidated.
The idea that she was somehow peer-pressured, bullied, or intimidated by her own peasant servants into roasting human flesh and shoving needles under fingernails is utterly absurd. To me, this is a classic textbook sociopathic deflection tactic. She's finally caught, the game is over, and her immediate reflexive instinct is to play the victim and shift the blame to the lower-class staff.
That is a very sound psychological assessment. She was the absolute authority. They acted strictly on her orders, not the other way around. But her arrest didn't just end the murders. It triggered a massive, high-stakes legal and political chess match across the kingdom.
The politics of it all.
Yes, King Matthias II wanted her tried, convicted, and sentenced to a public death.
And we have to look very closely at the king's motives here. Why did he want her dead? King Matthias wasn't necessarily just driven by moral outrage or a sudden love for peasant girls.
No, follow the money.
Exactly. He owed Elizabeth Báthory a massive, crippling financial debt. The Báthorys had essentially been bankrolling the crown's wars. If she was convicted of treason or mass murder and executed, under the law of the era, all of her vast property, castles, and wealth would be legally seized by the crown.
It would all go to him.
And the king's massive debts to her estate would simply be canceled overnight.
The financial incentive was huge. On January 14th, 1611, King Matthias wrote a furious, demanding letter to Thurzo. He states he heard with paralyzing fear and internal shuddering that she had killed over 300 innocent women in a most monstrous and cruel manner.
Laying on the moral outrage pretty thick.
Very sick. But then he immediately issues a strict, urgent royal order to Thurzo. He demands that Báthory be summoned to court, that the judgment proceed swiftly, and that she face the full penalty of the law of death. He explicitly tells Thurzo anything else shall not proceed.
So no leniency.
He wants her head on a block, and he wants her lands in his treasury.
But Thurzo, the Palatine, is playing his own deep political game here. He circumvented the king entirely. Thurzo quietly coordinated with Báthory's son-in-law, Nicola VI, Zrinski, and her son, Paul Nadezhdy.
A secret alliance.
Yeah. They sat down and realized that a public execution would permanently destroy the powerful Báthory family name, and worse, it would result in the total loss of all that generational wealth to the king.
Paul actually wrote a letter to Thurzo in February 1611 that outlines this conspiracy of wealth preservation perfectly. He profusely thanked Thurzo for ignoring the king's demands for horrible judicial torture and execution.
Just flat out thanked him for defying the king.
Yes. Paul wrote that Thurzo chose the lesser of two evils by putting her under strict house arrest instead of executing her, because it preserved our honor and shielded us from too great a shame.
Incredible.
Furthermore, Paul smugly notes in the letter that there's no need for the king to fret over seizing the property, because shortly before her arrest, Elizabeth had already legally transferred all her immense wealth, lands, and castles directly to her children.
Checkmate against the king. She moved the money before the royal auditors could seize it, and Thurzo protected her from the executioner's block specifically to keep the massively powerful Báthory family in his own political debt. It is a stunning display of aristocratic privilege shielding a monster.
Which brings us to a major modern historical debate. Knowing that King Matthias owed her money, and knowing the complex political maneuvering that took place behind the scenes to secure her arrest, some modern scholars have asked a highly provocative question.
Was this all a massive political setup?
Exactly.
This is known as the frame-up theory. Starting in the 1980s, scholars like Laszlo Nagy and Irma Sadecki-Cardos argued that Elizabeth Báthory was entirely innocent, that she was the victim of a politically motivated witch hunt orchestrated by men who wanted her power.
They look at the macro geopolitics of the era.
Right. You have Elizabeth, a vastly wealthy Calvinist Protestant, living within the staunchly Catholic Habsburg Empire. Her nephew, Prince Gabriel Báthory, ruled Transylvania and was a legitimate, armed threat to King Matthias's throne.
The theory posits that the imperial court in Vienna desperately needed to discredit the Báthory family to neutralize the military and political threat from Transylvania. Furthermore, as we noted, King Matthias's massive debt to her was a powerful motive.
A huge motive.
And Thurzo, the investigator, had his own ambitions. He desperately wanted his own son to become Prince of Transylvania, putting him in direct political competition with Báthory's family.
The scholars pushing the frame-up theory also have an explanation for the dead and dying girls found at the castle during the raid and the bodies buried in the garden.
the medical care defense.
Yes, they argue that as a major feudal landowner, Báthory was legally responsible for providing medical care to the people on her lands. They suggest that during an era of plagues and harsh winters, the dead and injured girls were simply sick patients brought to the castle for treatment in a makeshift hospital. They argue that Thurzo intentionally misrepresented tragic medical deaths as sadistic murders to frame her and steal her wealth.
This raises an important question, though. How does the frame-up theory hold up against the actual physical forensic evidence we have spent this time detailing?
Not very well.
As a critical analyst, I have to systematically take down this defense using the evidence we just discussed. If it was just a frame-up orchestrated by the Catholic king to crush a Protestant rival, why was the entire investigation sparked by the insistent public complaints of a Lutheran minister, Istvan Megary?
And Thurzo himself was Lutheran, so the entire Catholic versus Protestant conspiracy angle is already incredibly wobbly. It doesn't hold water.
Exactly. But more importantly, how did the frame-up theorists explain the vast mountain of testimonies? We aren't just talking about a few tortured peasant servants who were forced to confess to whatever the interrogators wanted to hear.
No, we have high-ranking officials.
Right. How do you explain the untortured sworn testimonies of high-ranking castellans, estate managers, and court judges like Benedek Duzio and Gergely Pastore? These were men who managed her own estates. They were fiercely loyal to her family, yet they testified to her atrocities under oath.
How do you explain over 300 separate testimonies from nobles, clergy, and commoners spanning a decade? And when you look at the physical details of the abuse, how does providing medical care explain deliberately broken fingers?
It doesn't.
How does a 16th century hospital setting explain roasting a woman's flesh, or shoving sewing needles deep under fingernails, or forcing naked girls out into the freezing winter until they literally turn to ice and die of hypothermia?
Those actions have zero medical utility, even in the archaic funeral medicine of the 1500s. Furthermore, Castellan Michael Horvath's testimony about the stray dogs digging up mutilated bodies from shallow graves in the garden completely undermines the idea of a legitimate medical operation.
Absolutely.
If patients die in a Lord's care while receiving honest medical treatment, they are given proper, sanctified Christian burials in a cemetery, not thrown into shallow dirt in a backyard garden like garbage.
So what does this all mean for the frame-up theory? It means the conspiracy theory conflates the response to the crime with the invention of the crime.
That's a great way to put it.
Yes, the political environment was toxic. Yes, the king owed her a massive fortune. Yes, Thurzo absolutely used the situation to his political advantage to secure debts from her family. The politics absolutely dictated how she was punished.
Like why she got house arrest.
Exactly. Why she got a comfortable house arrest instead of a brutal public execution, and how the family wealth was protected from the crown. But the politics did not invent the crimes. The forensic footprint is simply too massive, too detailed, and too corroborated by independent, untortured witnesses from every level of society to be a fiction.
Precisely. The political machinations were simply the scaffolding built around the building. But the building itself, the Gynaeceum of Horrors, was terrifyingly real. Which brings us to our final section. The aftermath, the justice served, and the birth of the enduring folklore covering 1611 to 1614 and beyond.
While Elizabeth was completely protected from the executioner's blade by her royal blood and her family's strategic wealth transfers, her accomplices faced the full, brutal, unrelenting wrath of 17th century justice. In January 1611, the servants who carried out her orders, who physically held the girls down, were tortured and executed.
The methods of their executions were horrific, reflecting the absolute severity of the crimes they were convicted of. Ilona Jo and Dorokia Sentis, the older women who actively participated in the torture and instructed others, faced a gruesome end.
What happened to them?
They had their fingers systematically torn out with red-hot iron pincers as punishment for what they did to the victim's hands, and then they were thrown onto a pyre and burned alive.
Janos, the young male servant known as Fisco, was deemed slightly less culpable by the court due to his youth and lower rank. His punishment was considered less painful by the standards of the day. He was mercifully beheaded first, and then his headless corpse was thrown onto the exact same burning pyre as Ilona and Dorothea.
A small mercy, I suppose.
Another servant, Ertsia Manjarova, initially managed to escape the dragnet, but she was eventually caught and also burned alive. Only Katerina Benica received a life sentence, because evidence produced at trial showed she had actually been physically abused and forced into compliance by the other, more dominant servants.
With the accomplices dead and the countess locked away, we are left with the grim accounting of the victims. How many women actually died at her hands?
The ultimate question.
During the trial of the accomplices, a servant named Susanna claimed that Jacob Silvassi, the court official, had seen a private ledger, a book kept by Báthory herself, that logged exactly 650 victims.
650. That number is legendary in true crime circles. But here is the critical fact. That book was never found, and Silvassi himself, when he testified under oath, never mentioned seeing any such book. So that specific number of 650 might be the very early stages of folklore and exaggeration creeping into the trial narrative.
That is highly likely. But even if we discard the mythical book, the numbers given under oath by the high-ranking estate managers are still staggering.
What were their estimates?
Benedek Bixerdi, the castellan at Sarvar, testified that he personally knew of at least 175 girls and women who had died at that one castle alone. Another castellan, Baltazar Podi, testified that he heard the deaths at Sarvar were well over 200, quote, if not already mounting to nearly 300.
Wow.
And those numbers don't even include the deaths at Sechce, the Geniceum, or her properties in Vienna.
It's an industrialized, staggering scale of serial murder. As for Báthory herself, Thurzos wrote a letter to the king confirming she had been captured and permanently confined to Kisete Castle. Now here is where another massive myth needs to be busted.
Oh, the bricked-up room myth.
Yes. The popular legend says she was bricked up alive in a single windowless room with only a tiny slit left open for servants to pass her scraps of food until she rotted away in the dark.
The historical documents prove otherwise. Priests who visited her in July 1614 noted that she was able to move unhindered within the castle walls.
So it wasn't solitary confinement.
No, it was a strict house arrest. She could not leave the fortress, but she was absolutely not immured in a brick wall. She lived in relative comfort and confinement for a few years, having already secured her legacy by willing her vast estates to her children.
And then came the sudden end. On the evening of August 20th, 1614, she was 54 years old. She complained to her bodyguard that her hands were feeling unusually cold.
And his response was?
And his response was incredibly dismissive, basically saying, "It's nothing, mistress, just go lie down." She went to sleep, and they found her dead the next morning.
She was initially buried in the local church of Sete on November 25, 1614. However, some historical sources say the local villagers were in an absolute uproar about having this prolific mass murderer buried in their local sacred cemetery.
Understandably so.
To quell the unrest, her body was quietly moved to her birth home at Exed and placed in the Báthory family crypt. Today, centuries later, the exact location of her body is unknown. There are no markings at Sete indicating a grave, and the Exed crypt has been lost to time.
She vanishes into the earth, but her legend just explodes out of it. And here is the final fascinating twist of the forensic timeline we've built today. The whole idea of the Blood Countess, the Gothic woman who bathed in tubs of virgin blood to retain her youth and beauty, none of that is in the 1611 trial transcripts. Not a single word.
It's entirely fabricated.
None of the 300 witnesses mention bloodbaths.
The bloodbath myth did not appear in print until 1729. That is more than a century after she died. It was written by a Jesuit scholar named Laszlo Tarocci in a book called Tragica Historia.
So it was just a story.
It was a highly sensationalized piece of fiction designed to titillate readers, and it stuck in the public consciousness forever. When the actual factual witness accounts from the 1611 trial were finally published in 1817, they clearly showed zero evidence of bloodbaths. And even the cultural connection to Bram Stoker's Dracula is tenuous at best. Stoker's own private notes for his 1897 novel provide no direct evidence that he based his vampire character on her.
We took a hard look at the historical record today, and the muddy waters cleared to reveal something profoundly unsettling. The true story of Elizabeth Báthory proves that human sadism is far more terrifying and far more real than supernatural vampirism.
It's the reality of power without consequences.
Yes. We as a culture invented the myth of the Blood Countess. We made up the story that she bathed in virgin blood for eternal youth because it gives her horrific atrocities a supernatural, almost glamorous motive. It makes her a monster of vanity, a creature of dark magic.
It softens the blow of what humanity is capable of.
Exactly. But the rigorous forensic timeline we just unpacked shows us the grim, unvarnished reality. She didn't do it for youth or magic or beauty. She didn't bathe in blood. She used sewing needles and freezing ultra water and starvation and red-hot irons. She did it simply because she had absolute unchecked power and because she derived deep sadistic pleasure from breaking the bodies of others.
The historical truth is much harder to look at.
It is. So I leave you with this final thought to mull over on your own. When you look at the monsters of history, How often do we drape them in folklore just to protect ourselves? What does it say about human nature that we are so much more comfortable with the idea of a fictional, magical monster than we are with the reality of profound human cruelty, completely shielded by extreme wealth and political privilege? If we need a vampire to explain the darkness in our own species, what are we still refusing to look at today?
That's a question that sticks with you.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep looking at the evidence, and always remember to look beyond the myths.